Throughout the 60s, the Soviet Union led the space race. The first human in orbit, first woman, first couple, even the first spacewalk. And that was after the first satellite, Sputnik, in 1957, along with the first dog, Laika, on Sputnik 2, who didn't last too long up there. But then the Americans pulled an ace out of the pack, an event that had the world looking up to the heavens in disbelief.
Most people these days have become rather blasé about space exploration. Nowadays, if you've got the money, practically anyone can hitch a ride into space.
Ignition sequence start. 6.
Half a century ago, space and the moon were the unexplored frontiers. On the 20th of July 1969, the Apollo 11 lunar landing became one of the defining moments of the 20th century.
I think technology and scientific endeavor just made great moves forward.
Capcom, we're go for landing. Altitude 4,200. Houston, you're go for landing, over. Roger, understand. Go for landing. 3,000 feet. You're looking great.
It must have been extremely hair-raising for them as well, until Neil Armstrong actually stood with his feet on that surface. He wasn't quite sure. Was he going to sink? Was it made of fine dust?
2 inches. Although the surface appears to be very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder.
Try to imagine the impact of a venture which was considered impossible. It started to raise new questions in the mind.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Those words describe the sense of feeling that I think adults had.
But in 1969, Minister of Science and Technology Naledi Pandor was 14 years old and an ardent science fiction fan.
For us, we were watching for what might go wrong. We were looking for the monster.
The minister was living in exile in London with her parents.
The 60s were interesting political times. You had John F. Kennedy's assassination, Martin Luther King.
And in South Africa, Nelson Mandela was jailed for treason. Cars cost a couple of R1,000. A bottle of brandy was R1.60. And the race between America and the Soviet Union to get to the moon first grabbed the world's imagination.
1969 saw the great event of the lunar landing.
Tony Voorveld was a young technician at the Hartbeespoort tracking station. His passion for astronomy meant that he spent much of his spare time at the Johannesburg Planetarium following the dramatic events. 600 million people in 49 countries throughout the world sat glued to their television sets watching the drama of the moon landing. South Africa was not one of those countries.
Well, one feels awfully left out, You knew that just up the road in Rhodesia of those days, Rhodesia today, Zimbabwe, they had television. We didn't. It was strange.
It was in church circles, certain religious circles, and in typical Afrikaner conservative thinking, a diabolical thing, this television story.
Former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Pik Botha, clearly remembers why the far right wing of the nationalist government of the time opposed television.
The major problem was Minister Herzog, Albert Herzog. He was absolutely against the introduction of television, believing, it would have a very nefarious effect on the youth. They would be seeing all sorts of pornographic and disastrous shows and videos and programs, which would have this negative effect on the minds of the children and the younger people in this country.
So, most South Africans were forced to follow the historic event on radio or in the newspapers. The Johannesburg Planetarium, however, got special permission from the government to show the moon landing. Thousands of South Africans thronged to this auditorium at the Johannesburg Planetarium to watch recordings of the moon landing. Special television monitors were set up around this podium under the projector, and these screenings went on for weeks. Every evening, the latest footage was flown out from London and the tapes were handed to someone waiting at the then Jan Smuts airport.
He would get, or she would get into a car, whatever the case was, go herring through to the planetarium in Johannesburg. We would load the tapes on, check that they all worked, and then by 10 o'clock when the shows started, we would be ready.
We've been told that the queue started here in Yale Road and went up all the way to Jorrison Street and beyond. Apartheid laws didn't allow mixed audiences. One special viewing was organized for black South Africans, desperate to get a glimpse of the dramatic event.
The whole of Yale Road was thronging with people. And I believe the throngs came all the way from Braamfontein Station. They were thronging from there already. That's a hang of a distance.
The planetarium couldn't cope with the numbers, and only a few thousand black South Africans got to see this historic event. It all started with a Russian satellite called Sputnik, which was launched on the 4th of October 1957. And even though it only stayed up for 7 days and recorded basic things like temperature, Sputnik signaled the beginning of the space race between Cold War enemies America and Russia. Until the mid-60s, the Soviets were the clear leaders. A few months after Sputnik, they sent Laika the dog into space. In 1961, Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin made history when he orbited the Earth for 108 minutes. The space race was not without its lighter moments. In the early 1960s, a primary school teacher decided to take on America and Russia when he established the Zambian Academy of Science and Space Philosophy. Edward Nkoloso became notorious for his unofficial space program. Nkoloso planned to send 10 astronauts, a space girl, some cats, and a missionary to the moon.
Mr. Nkoloso, is this the site for your rocket launching program? And could you tell me where your rocket is?
Yes, this is the rocket launching site, and my rocket is just here.
Nkolosa had some novel ideas on how to train his astronauts. They included rolling his trainees down a hill in a 44-gallon drum and floating in a barrel for splashdown.
What do you think the reaction of America and Russia will be to Zambia's joining in the space race?
Oh, they'll be only surprised.
Has President Kaunda given permission for your project? And has the Zambian government approved of it?
Not as yet, but they have taken interest in seeing what I'm doing.
Needless to say, the Zambian government distanced itself from Nkolosa, and without any funding, his project never got off the ground.
And so here at an abandoned farmhouse not far from Lusaka, we have a youthful group of budding astronauts playing at entering Zambia for the world's space race. However, to most Zambians, these people are just a bunch of crackpots. And from what I have seen today, I'm inclined to agree.
On the other side of the world, the real space race was hotting up. Under President John F. Kennedy, the Americans started to catch up with the Soviets. In May 1969, Apollo 10 orbited the moon. The mission was broadcast live and in color for the first time.
We got the whole globe there.
The pictures from the moon of the Earth, that is overwhelming. You cannot describe the impact of that.
We're looking at
The Earth rising and the Earth going setting. This white, greenish, bluish, big thing there in a distance.
2 months later, on the 16th of July, Apollo 11 was launched. It took 3 days to get to the moon.
Beautiful view. Isn't that something? Magnificent sight out here. Magnificent desolation.
Once Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stepped out of the lunar module, they had 2 hours to put up a few scientific instruments, collect some moon rocks and plant the flag. Then they had to fire off from the moon and rejoin the command module.
If the engine didn't fire, that would have been it. That would have been curtains for these guys. The rocket that was used to send them back was a very simple device. It was no more complex than the rockets that were used in the Second World War in the V-2s.
The rocket fired and the lunar module docked onto the command module. 3 days later, the astronauts splashed down in the Pacific Ocean.
Apollo 11, Apollo 11.
It was an interesting, I suppose, unifier at that time in something that was being done by a country, but which somehow drew all of us together.
After the triumphant success of Apollo 11, many believed that lunar trips would become as routine as aeroplane flights.
So questions were being asked, might the moon be the future home that human beings should look to?
That was 40 years ago, and nothing much has happened on the moon since then. Recently, however, a new moon race has been shaping up. Japan, China, India and America are all planning manned lunar missions. And who knows, one of them may build the first moon base.
030.
Wasn't that absolutely fascinating, especially the Zambian entry into the space race?